And I have 9 o'clock on my computer, so we are going to get started. Thank you so much for attending today, our Zoom training. On the screen, you will see that for our new and only new food service directors, we want to know who you are. Please put your name, your school name, email, and phone in the chat box. We do that because we want to give our new food service directors a little special attention and reach out to them either now or at the beginning of the school year to see how things are going. So next slide. You are attending the back to school meals training, and your presenters for today are myself, Sean Vondratchek. I have Donna Hadley with us, Erica Arter, Lauren Christensen, and Taylor Schwartz is manning our Zoom today. Taylor is the newest member of our team. She joined us in late May, and she is learning all about the school meals program. So we just welcome you and thank you for taking the day to be with us. So next slide. So a big welcome, and we just to kind of give you some housekeeping tips for today, we're going to have some stand and stretch breaks throughout the day. We're going to have plenty of time for lunch. We're going to have 30 minutes, and that'll be somewhere between probably 11:30 and 12 is our hope. We have a lot of material to cover today, but we know how important it is that you have a good lunch and you get away from this training for a little bit. We are going to finish on time. Our goal is 3:30. Please mute your microphones throughout the presentation. If you like, we love to see you and would like you to turn on your camera so we can kind of judge how the training is going. If we see your heads drop on a table, we know we need to liven things up. And please enter your questions that you have during the presentation into the chat box. But do keep in mind, we will be covering a lot of material today. So we will hopefully address all of your questions in the presentation. And you have your handout packet that was sent as a link, and we would like you to have that available because we will be referring to that throughout the presentation. Next slide. Once again, I know that some people maybe have joined us just a little bit later, but we want to make sure that our new food service directors enter their name, school name, email, and phone in the chat box. Next slide. And the first handout in your packet is the training certificate. And we are using the honor system today for training, in that you fill in the number of hours that you attend for this training. And the training is 6 hours of continuing education. And if you stay until the end, you will have the 6 hours. If you leave before then, you need to indicate the number of hours that you have attended the training. We encourage you to stay until the end because we're covering a lot of information, and I think it will be less stressful for you during the school year if you have the opportunity to listen to all the information that we're providing. After today's training, our goal is to make sure that you're able to plan lunch and breakfast menus that meet the USDA meal pattern requirements. We will be covering preschool meal pattern during the presentation. And then at the very end of the presentation today, we will be talking about the after school care snack program and the special milk program. Okay, we put those at the end of the presentation. because not every school participates in those two programs. So if you do participate in the after school care snack program and the special milk program, please stay to listen to that portion. We will be answering questions before that section, and then we'll go into those two topics. Our goal also in today's training is to make sure that you are able to identify what constitutes a reimbursable meal. And then with any federal program that you participate in, there is required daily record keeping. And we will go into detail about production records, the documentation that you've met meal pattern. So that's our goals for today. Next slide. So just a little bit of a legislative roadmap to where we are today. For the last almost 2.5 years, we've had waivers that have allowed the school meals program to operate to get kids fed through this pandemic. USDA was issued nationwide waiver authority by Congress under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and all of the waivers were expected to end as of June 30th, 2022. But prior to the expiration date on June 25th, 2022, President Biden signed the Keep Kids Fed Act, which provides USDA with limited waiver authority for school year 22-23. So we're going to talk about the key points of the Keep Kids Fed Act that are important to you. Next slide. Well, the Keep Kids Fed Act provides temporary higher per meal reimbursement rates in the National School Lunch and Breakfast Program through June of 2023. The school year runs from July 1st, 2022 through June of 2023. This temporary higher per meal reimbursement rate is for breakfast and lunch. It's an additional 15 cents for each breakfast and an additional 40 cents for each lunch. This is stacked on top of the reimbursement rates. As I said, it's a temporary increase for the upcoming school year. The Keep Kids Fed Act also allows USDA limited waiver authority through June of 2023. So some of the things, the key points of this act that are important to know is it extended some deadlines. So like the local wellness policy triennial assessment, which was due a number of years ago, has been extended. It provided some relief with the paid lunch equity, which was your paid meal prices and the requirements for that, which apply to setting paid lunch prices. And then it also applies for some flexibility if the need arises in your particular school or community, if you would have something that would happen due to the unpredictable nature of COVID and what would happen in your community. So it does provide some flexibility in how you get kids fed if you would have an increase in COVID. So how that works is you would notify our office if perhaps your school would close due to COVID, or if you would need to provide meals in an alternative fashion, like we've done in the past. but it is a very limited flexibility and it's on a case-by-case basis. So you just need to know that you need to contact our office if that situation would present itself. Next slide. What the Keep Kids Fed Act doesn't do, it doesn't provide authority for USDA to issue nationwide waivers for school year 22-23 that have a cost to the federal government. So there's no highest rate of reimbursement, which in the last 2 years, our schools have gotten the highest rate of reimbursement, which happens to be under the summer food service program, but no more. That is why there's that temporary increase in reimbursement rates for breakfast and lunch. So no more highest rate of reimbursement. So just be aware of that, but the additional layer of reimbursement, there's no ability to operate the seamless summer option like we did last year, which was USDA's transition back to the school meals meal pattern. But we will not be operating under the seamless summer option. We are operating under the traditional school meals program for school year 22-23. And there is no more meals at no cost to students. So we are going back to the traditional paid, free, and reduced rates of reimbursement. There's no expansion of area eligibility during the school year, and how that applies to the school meals program was that there was that ability to operate the after-school care program and receive the free rate of reimbursement if you were non-area eligible, which means that you had less than 50% free and reduced. You were allowed to claim all snacks at the free rate of reimbursement. If you are under 50% free and reduced, snacks have to be claimed at the paid, reduced, and free rates of reimbursement for the after-school care snack program. And we will be using school year 19-20 eligibility to establish area eligibility because that was our last normal year of operation. So we are transitioning even more back to a normal school meals program. Next slide. So for those of you that are new in our audience, welcome. Congratulations on your new positions in working with in schools, feeding kids. But we want to give you a little bit of a background on how this program operates. Our school food authorities, and we refer to those as SFAs, lots of acronyms in the school meals program, but our school food authorities must adhere to the rules and regulations of the school meals program in order to receive federal dollars. So to get the money for the meals that are served to students, there is a whole set of rules and regulations that need to be adhered to, and we're going to cover those in detail today. But USDA provides those federal dollars in the form of reimbursement for meals served in schools. That money is funneled down to the Department of Education in Nebraska. Nutrition Services works in coordination with financial services at the department to distribute these dollars. Next slide. to our schools and institutions, but in order to receive those dollars, you are required to meet the federal regulations. And nutrition services staff conduct what we call administrative reviews, ARs, and procurement reviews, which we refer to as PRs, to ensure compliance with the rules and regulations of the program. Well, due to COVID, that really changed things for the last couple of years, we did not conduct administrative reviews in school year 2021 because our schools were operating under a different program, the summer food service program, during the school year. And that program had its own reviews that were conducted, not the school meals program reviews, but the summer food service program reviews. So no administrative or procurement reviews were conducted in that school year. And last year, school year 21-22, you operated the seamless summer program option under the school meals program, and we conducted a limited number of administrative reviews and procurement reviews just because schools were dealing with a lot last year, and having a review on top of all of the things that were happening last year really limited the number of reviews that we conducted. So our review cycle, which is the 5-year review cycle, now has been extended, and we will be conducting both administrative reviews and procurement reviews this upcoming school year. And we have not set our schedule yet for this school year. We will be in the next month. And we will notify our SFAs, our school food authorities, if they will be having one of these reviews. They're conducted at the same time in the fall. So we don't know the review cycle yet, but we will, and we will notify. In the fall, you'll have plenty of notice to prepare for this review. So just keep that in mind, and let's move on to more information you need to know. As I said, we are transitioning back to the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. Meals must be claimed by students' eligibility, which is the free, reduced, and paid. Reimbursement at the school meals program rate, and USDA published those rates yesterday, July 25th. We've been waiting anxiously for those to be released from USDA. And be aware that there is a 7.4% increase in breakfast and lunch reimbursement rates, which is higher than it has ever been. It is based on the Consumer Price Index for food away from home. And we all know that we are experiencing sticker shock with the ever increasing food costs and supply costs. And so normally that increase is anywhere from 2 to 3% annually. And this year it's 7.4%. Plus, there's the additional temporary increase that I've mentioned for school year 22-23, which is the 15 cents on top of the reimbursement rates for breakfast, all breakfast, and 40 cents for all lunch meals, in addition to the increase in reimbursement rates. I also want to mention that the performance-based incentive, which has normally been 7 cents, is now increasing to 8 cents for school year 22-23. Another layer of reimbursement for meeting the meal pattern requirements in regard to the vegetable subgroups and the whole grain requirements. This is a layer of reimbursement that can be turned off if schools are not in compliance with those additional requirements of meal pattern, which we will be discussing in this training. But I did want to bring your attention that that is also increasing. The rates of reimbursement can be found under quick links on the Nutrition Services website. It's under quick links, reimbursement rates. And if you would go to that right now, the rates have not been updated yet because the rates were just released yesterday. So, but do anticipate that rather quickly, those rates will be updated on the Nutrition Services website. Now, for more information on the exact rates, I've included the link to the Federal Register at the bottom of the slide. And one of my coworkers is entering that link into the chat. So that information is available to you as it has been published. It's just not updated yet on our website. So great news. You know, higher rates of reimbursement, an additional layer of reimbursement for this upcoming school year, and then an increase in the performance-based incentive. So let's move to the next slide, and I will be turning it over to Lauren to talk, or am I correct? Lauren to talk with us about the lunch meal pattern.
Right, thanks, Sean. That was a helpful intro for us. I'm sure you all are just as excited as I am to explore the National School Lunch Meal Pattern, or at least I hope so. There were a couple of changes that we will recognize this year as a result of those transitional meal pattern standards. And those were released in February of this year and went into effect as of July 1. So those will impact school year 22-23. I did want to mention before we get going here that this particular section is going to focus on that lunch meal pattern. However, if you also operate the school breakfast program or a preschool meal pattern, we will talk about each of those meal patterns separately. And then as Sean stated before, if you operate the after school care program or a special milk program, please do stick around at the end. We recognize that not all sites operate those programs, and so we wanted to target that to those that it was most applicable for. All right, so next slide, please. So the key considerations when we talk about the National School Lunch Program is that it is a food-based meal pattern, and it requires foods to be served from different food groups, and we refer to those as components. In addition, certain portion sizes will be based around specific food groups. So again, depending on the grade groups that you serve, there's going to be required specific portion size of each component, and we'll delve into that in further detail as we move through each of these components. And then finally, all menus must adhere to USDA nutrient standards, and those standards are around calories, saturated fat, trans fats, and sodium. So as we continue to move through our slides, I will elaborate on each of these and provide some additional considerations for you to think about in terms of implementing this program into your operation. All right, next slide. So as I mentioned, and I'm sure you are all aware, there are 5 different meal components for the lunch meal pattern, and that consists of a meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. And I think it's important to kind of think about the why. So why do we want to offer each of these meal components to our students at lunch? I think there's a multitude of ways that you could answer that. But as a dietitian, the things that come to my mind, and also as a parent that with a child in school that participates in school lunch, I think about these combinations of foods and how they provide energy and protein and various vitamins and minerals to our kids throughout the school day. So that in turn nourishes these children's bodies. It allows them to learn. It allows them to be successful as they go throughout their school day. It's really helping set them up for a greater chance at, being able to apply the things that they're learning in the classroom, both in and outside of the classroom. And then also, I think a big component here is having a combination of foods is going to offer a better feeling of fullness, or that feeling of satiety. So it's going to carry a child throughout the school day better than if maybe they only have a couple of items, that they maybe bring in a sack lunch or something. So we know that the most nutrient bang for your buck, so to speak, is going to come from a combination of these 5 food groups. And then lastly, we know that in general, this is going to promote overall health. So lots of benefits. I'm sure you can think of numerous others, but those are the ones that really come to the forefront of my mind when we talk about the why behind serving these various meal components. Right, moving on to the next slide. So again, as I said, there are certain required grade groups, 3 to be exact. And this will depend a little bit on your school or your district or your organization setup. You may be serving multiple grade groups, or you may be an elementary only, or a high school only, or middle school only. So again, just think about how this applies in your particular setting. Those 3 required grade groups, though, will consist of grades K through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. There is a little bit of flexibility, again, depending on the grade groups that you serve. So if you are maybe a K through 12 site, or K through 8 even, you can utilize this grades K through 8 overlap. And that allows, again, for that flexibility, because we know that some of these components, the required portion size aligns fairly well for those grade groups. So basically, you don't have to plan for different portion sizes for K through 5 and 6 through 8. You have the flexibility to offer that overlap. And we'll see that as we move through the required portion sizes for each component. On the next slide, we do see that this is summarized in a really nice chart for you, and this is a part of your handout packet. This is a great resource to have up in all of your kitchens, especially for the individual that would be your meal planner or planning those cycle menus. Really just nice to have to refer back to if you're ever questioning, again, portion sizes for the grade groups that you serve. Just nice to be able to see that all on one sheet. And as I said, we'll talk about each of these specific components in further detail. But again, consider the reason that we want students to have access to these components. So I know sometimes in the day-to-day, it gets a little bit daunting to think about vegetable subgroups and things like that, but really we know that we're doing a wonderful service to the students that we serve by following these meal pattern requirements. Right, on the next slide, we'll dive in a little bit deeper into the meat and meat alternate category or component. So as we see on the chart, this shows that both the daily and the weekly minimum requirements for all grade groups. So we see that for grades K through 5 and 6 through 8, that daily requirement is going to be a 1 ounce equivalent of a cooked meat or meat alternate. Now, bear in mind, not all meat or meat alternates might be in cooked form. So think about yogurt. Obviously, you're not cooking that, but we'll talk about how some of these items would credit as well in a few more slides. That daily requirement jumps up to 2-ounce equivalents for grades 9 through 12. And then for the weekly requirements, you can see for grades 9 through 12, that breaks out nicely. So 2 ounces for 5 days comes out to that 10-ounce equivalent. So you meet both the daily and weekly requirements with that 2-ounce portion each lunch. For grades K through 5, the weekly requirement is 8 ounces, and 6 through 8, it would be 9 ounces. So for sites that would be using that K through 8 overlap, you would need to plan for 9-ounce equivalent to meet that weekly requirement in the overlap. So it goes to the larger or the higher of the two requirements. Now, if you want to keep it a little bit more simple, you could even just plan for 2 ounces across the board. We will talk more about nutrient standards and how that kind of comes into play when planning portion sizes, but do keep in mind that these are minimum requirements. So as long as you meet the minimum and you can stay within those nutrient standard targets, that is what you would be aiming for. So again, when you're planning those portion sizes, you may want to just consider what is the path of least resistance, or what is the easiest way that you can accomplish that if you are serving a multitude of different grade groups. And then as we go through these components, just keep in mind that we're referring to a week as being equivalent to a 5-day school week. All right, next slide. Back one, sorry, Taylor. Oh, maybe you jumped forward one. Okay, there we go. So for the meat alternate, it must be served in the main dish or as the main dish and one other menu item. If your site does not offer entree choices, the same form of meat should not be served more than 3 times a week. So an example of this would be for schools that maybe participate in farm to school, and maybe they have a beef program where they've paired up with a local farmer or rancher to supply beef. We would say, no more than that 3 times per week. Commonly, we see it occurring, maybe beef is offered twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays as a part of that program. But we want to ensure that we're introducing lots of variety in all of the different components throughout that school week. We know that encourages participation in different ways. So some students might be really excited about certain entrees or certain component items that are on the menu, and other days it might, not be so exciting to them. So by offering a variety, we can ensure that participation stays where we would like to see it, hopefully, and also that we're providing lots of different nutrients for our students. All right, on the next slide, we see some examples, and I'm sure all of us can kind of think about what examples of those meat alternates might be, but that would include items, meats, poultry, seafood, cheese, yogurt, eggs. Nuts and seeds can also count towards this category, but do keep in mind that those cannot exceed 50% of the daily requirement. Dried beans and peas could also credit under this component, but if you are menuing it as a vegetable, it cannot also count as a meat alternate. So you could plan this as either a meat alternate or as a vegetable, but they cannot credit as both in the same meal. And then in our in-person trainings that we did last week, we asked a little bit about tofu. We didn't see very many hands shoot up when we asked about whether any sites were offering tofu as a meat or meat alternate, but some. But that is another option that you could consider to integrate some additional variety. Of course, you have to factor in, when planning for this component, you have to factor in the cost and how that works out within your overall budget. So again, trying to implement some different items, some different variety can help your program not only be more cost effective, but again, it might increase participation because students are like a certain item, or they're maybe wanting to try a certain item. So just bear that in mind. And then soy yogurt, along with regular dairy yogurt, could also be served and would count under this particular component. So on the next slide, we do see how some of these items would credit. And on that chart that I mentioned as we got started on this section, you will see this also broken down. So that one-page summary of the lunch meal pattern also provides some of this crediting information for you for these meat alternate items. So cheese is pretty easy. 1 ounce credits as 1 ounce. If you're crediting dried beans or peas towards the meat alternate category, you would count 1/4 of a cup as a 1 ounce serving. Cottage cheese would also be 1/4 of a cup to yield a 1 ounce portion. 1 large egg would be equivalent to 2 ounces. But again, I would encourage you to think about how, we know that those grades 9 through 12 need 2 ounces of a meat or meat alternate. How would they look at 1 large hard-boiled egg on their tray as their full meat alternate portion? So again, kind of thinking about how that works in the overall scope of your menu offerings. Peanut butter, so if you're doing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, 2 tablespoons would equal 1 ounce. Yogurt, 4 ounces or 1/2 cup would be equivalent to 1 ounce. And then tofu, 2.2 ounces or 1/4 cup would equal 1 ounce. Some of those non-creditable items you can include on your menu. They would count as an other, so they wouldn't credit towards meeting meal pattern. And they would also affect your overall food cost, and they would also impact those nutrient standards. So if you're considering offering some of these items, just again, keep those considerations in mind. And it may just be a once in a while sort of thing. I know bacon is one of those that people are bummed to see on this non-creditable item list, but unfortunately, it does not credit towards meal pattern. Canned chicken noodle soup, again, in something like that, there would probably not be enough chicken or noodles really in one portion or one serving to be a creditable amount. Now, if you're making your own school recipe of chicken noodle soup, you have a little bit more control over how much chicken goes into that recipe, the vegetables, and how many servings or how much of the noodles would be in there that might credit to those various components. Imitation cheeses, commercial non-commodity cheese sauces, or powdered cheese mixes would also not be creditable. Keep in mind, commodity cheese sauces, those do have a child nutrition label. So that tells you exactly what serving you would need to offer, what portion you would need to offer, and how that would credit in terms of that meat alternate category. So that could be an option, but if it does not have a child nutrition label, it would be considered not creditable. All right. So we do want to encourage some participation today. We recognize that sitting on Zoom for 6 hours can get a little tiring. So hopefully, again, with our stand and stretch breaks and some other activities, we can help keep that interest peaked here. So we are going to do a little bit of an activity revolving around combination foods and how we would credit combination foods. So just as we get into that, I wanted to show you that at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom taskbar, maybe it's at the top, depending on how your screen is set up, you should see a view options. And if you click that down arrow, you all the way at the bottom or maybe somewhere in the middle, you will find an annotate feature, and that would allow you to bring up these different things. You can make squiggly lines, check marks. There's also a reactions page, but really we want you to be focusing on this annotation feature. So here in a couple slides, we'll use that, and we'll ask you to use that to help us determine how some items would credit. All right, next slide. So we recognize that several of you offer various combination foods within your menus. You know, we know that that really is helpful in crediting towards various food components or the different food components, but just kind of want you to think about, again, how do we identify how those items credit towards meeting meal pattern, or how do they contribute towards meeting meal pattern? So we're going to go through a couple of examples, and I'm sure, like I said, you can think of many more, but you know, vegetable beef soup could obviously credit towards a couple of different food components: cheeseburger on a bun, chicken and noodles, taco salad, and apple crisp, and many, many more. You know, it kind of allows you to have some flexibility when you're menuing these items, so that maybe you only have to add in a little bit more vegetables to help meet that overall meal pattern, because we know that we're getting some vegetables in some of these school recipes. So on the next slide, we'll go through one of these examples. So again, pull up that annotation feature, and I want you to just mark the box next to the components that you think would credit in a vegetable beef soup recipe. Great, I'm already seeing some pop up. Nice work. Love it. Okay. Very good. So pretty easy, right? I think we can all, you know, think about that there would be a meat alternate within this recipe, depending again on the amount of beef that is in there and per each portion or each serving. Vegetables we'll talk a little bit more about, in terms of you would need at least 1/8 of a cup to credit. So in this case, you know, when there's mixed vegetables and there's too many different types of vegetables, you would count that vegetable as your other subgroup. And then I do see some check marks in grains. Yeah, I agree with that. Depending on how that school recipe is created, you might have some rice or some barley or something in that recipe that could also credit towards that grain component. So nice work. So we see, yes, for meat alternates, obviously no fruit. I did have somebody argue, well, tomato is technically a fruit, but we credit it towards the vegetables. Again, each vegetable you wouldn't probably count separately in this. Vegetables, yes. Grains, yes. And then milk would not be creditable, because again, milk is going to be fluid milk. So when we talk about milk, it's not dairy, it's fluid milk. It can be dairy, but not all encompassing for like cheese or yogurt or anything like that. So keep that in mind as we move through the next couple examples. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, so we have taco salad. I don't know if those, okay, very good. You guys are already all over it. We see yes for meat alternate. So again, you might have some ground turkey, chicken, ground beef in that. Vegetables, again, we'll get into how that might credit. So just keep in mind that the leafy greens only count for about half of the portion that they're served. So 1 cup of lettuce would only equate to a 1/2 cup serving of vegetables. And then grains, yep, definitely, depending on the amount of corn chips or tortilla chips that you have in there, that could count. And then I also forgot to mention the cheese in the meat alternate category. So Milk would be a no. Again, that goes back to that fluid milk. I think we're having a hard time clearing maybe some of those annotations, but for apple crisp, obviously we see fruits being present in that one. When we did this in person, that our fruits don't get much love in this category, but definitely the fruits, the apples in there, grains could credit with the oats that would be the topping. So nicely done again. So all of you know, again, how these items would credit. Again, referring back to those school recipes, we will talk about labels as well and what we would look for in determining how certain items credit if it would not perhaps be a school recipe that you're utilizing. All right. Let's see, we're gonna clear those. Okay, so we will go on to our next component here of fruit. And we can see here, I'm gonna clear that annotation one more time. So go ahead and exit out of that annotation feature if you don't mind. All right, so for fruit component, the daily requirement for grades K through 5 and 6 through 8 is 1/2 of a cup. Grades 9 through 12 goes up to 1 cup for lunch. And then you can see those weekly requirements go hand in hand with those daily. So if you multiply 1/2 cup by 5, we would see that weekly requirement resulting in 2.5 cups. And then for grades 9 through 12, that 1 cup daily would equal 5 cups, obviously, throughout the course of that week. I do want to mention, that is a nice visual here that we see at the bottom of the screen. Lots of different colors, maybe, kind of that easy grab and go for students to make a quick decision based on their preferences. But again, I think the thing that draws me out is the color variety and maybe different textures. And we'll talk a little bit further about that here. All right, moving on to the next slide. So when we think about fruits, there are some certain considerations that we need to bear in mind as we menu these items. If you are menuing canned fruits, just keep in mind that those need to be packed in either their own juice or in light syrup. So we want to try to minimize the amount of added sugars, even though there's not a nutrient standard around added sugars, that would apply to the overall calorie content of those items. But also, if it's canned in a heavy syrup, it wouldn't be considered creditable. 100% fruit juice could also be served at lunch. And then no more than half of that fruit offering can be in the form of juice. So if you serve fruit juice at lunch, just keep in mind that you'll also want to have a different fruit variety available so that you can stay within that requirement. Here again, dried fruit credits a little bit differently. So 1/4 of a cup of dried fruit would equate to 1/2 of a cup. So that more condensed fruit, obviously you get a smaller portion, you still have a good amount of calories in that. So that is why that credits up instead of down, like in the instance of those leafy greens. And then same thing as vegetables, but the minimum serving size for fruits that would be creditable would be 1/8 of a cup. So keep that in mind as, again, you are planning those menus. On the next slide, we see that some non-creditable items would be those fruit snack or fruit leather, fruit shape items. And the reason for this is that children need to be able to recognize the actual piece of fruit that they are eating. So, again, we want them to be able to determine, hey, this is a strawberry, this is an apple. Even if something is 100% fruit juice in these items, it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily easy for the child to verify what fruit is actually comprised in that item. So those would not be creditable, so don't purchase those. Stick with the fruit juice, the canned, frozen, fresh fruit varieties. Right. Moving on, we'll talk about vegetables here next. And for the K through 8 grade groups, we see the daily requirement being 3/4 of a cup, with grades 9 through 12 needing 1 cup daily. That weekly requirement for grades K through 8 is 3 3/4 cup and 5 cups for grades 9 through 12. We do on vegetables see, again, some subgroups that we'll talk about. So we want to make sure that there's lots of different colors. We want to make sure that we're meeting those subgroup requirements. And we'll dive into that a little bit further in terms of how you would need to plan your menus. On the next slide, similar to what we see or what we saw on fruits, vegetable juice, if it's 100% vegetable juice, may also be served at lunch. Canned soup that is vegetable based, 1 cup serving would be 1/4 of a cup of vegetable, unless there's a child nutrition label that states otherwise. So maybe if you have that child nutrition label, it tells you that it credits as a 1/2 cup of vegetables. So if you, in the absence of that label, you would have to go off of this, what we're seeing here in terms of how that would credit. Cooked dried beans and peas, again, could count under the vegetable category, but you cannot count it as both a vegetable and a meat alternate on the same meal or on the same day there. And then here again, that minimum serving size to credit is 1/8 of a cup. Keep in mind, again, non-creditable items such as potato chips and pizza sauce. It's not that those items can't be offered. Obviously, we would see pizza sauce being offered and occasionally potato chips. Sun chips is a little bit different. That would be something that could be creditable as a grain item, but regular potato chips, even though they can be offered, keep in mind that they would count towards those nutrient standards, and also how that factors into your overall food cost. All right, next slide, we see those vegetable subgroups broken out, and we'll talk about each of these. I do want to point out that you have a nice handout that has a little bit more of an all-inclusive list of vegetables that would fall within each of these subgroups. But again, I go back to the why. So why do we want to make sure that there's a lot of variety of different vegetables, different colors that we see? As a dietitian, I often hear other dietitians, and I've known myself to say, we want people to eat the rainbow. And we're not necessarily talking about Skittles or Lucky Charms, but we want that color variety because not only is it visually appealing, but we also know that color variation, those different fruits or vegetables can provide different nutrients for our bodies. So if we have a well-rounded or nicely balanced intake of different types, we can ensure that our bodies are getting the nutrients that they need to work hard, play hard, do all those things in between. So again, the minimum amount to plan for each subgroup is based on a per week without daily requirements. So as we look through these next couple slides, just remember that these vegetable subgroup requirements are based on weekly requirements. Right. So first up, we see this dark green subgroup, and the portion size for grades K through 12 would be that 1/2 of a cup per week. Some examples would include things like broccoli, romaine, spinach. And again, as we see on the next slide, keep in mind how those leafy greens might credit a little bit differently. So if you are serving 1 cup of romaine lettuce, that would only really credit as a 1/2 of a cup of vegetable under this subgroup category. And then cooked leafy greens, so those are going to be equal to the volume served. So if you have half of a cup of cooked spinach, that is going to credit as a half of a cup of a vegetable. I do know for some of you, if you have fruit and vegetable bars, you might have a salad bar, for instance, and you might have 50-50 salad mix on there. So since that would contain things like romaine and some iceberg lettuce, 1 cup serving would give you a half of a cup of vegetable, but only 1/4 of that, 1/4 cup of that would count towards this dark green vegetable subgroup. So again, just pay attention to how those items might credit. If you have questions, you can always feel free to reach out to our office just for further clarification on those. Moving on to the red-orange subgroup. So we see the portion sizes for the week are different for grades K through 8. They would require 3/4 of a cup per week, and grades 9 through 12 would need 1 1/4 cup per week. This is probably one of those that is a little bit easier that we hear in our office to meet. So items such as tomatoes, carrots, sweet potatoes, red peppers, those would all credit towards this subgroup requirement. Dried beans and peas, we've already talked a little bit about. These might also be known as legumes. The portion size is the same for all grade groups, K through 12, and a half cup would be required per week. There's lots of different types. So you could have vegetarian, kidney beans, navy, refried beans, garbanzo beans. Again, in some of our in-person trainings, we were curious to hear how sites were offering this subgroup. We had several sites say that they're offering black beans or garbanzo beans on their fruit or vegetable bar or their salad bars. Some were doing hummus, which is awesome. Others were saying, you know, in the fall and the winter months, we might have soups like chili, where we would see some of these bean requirements or the subgroup being met. In addition, things like baked beans would also credit towards this category. All right, our starchy subgroup. So I think from Nebraska, being the Cornhusker state, we can all at least identify one easy vegetable that would fit within this category. But potatoes, corn, peas, and the portion size here again is the same across the board for K through 12, being a half cup per week. Now, with these, I do want to mention that while there is not necessarily like a maximum limit, keep in mind how these again would contribute to those nutrient standards. So for calories, if you have, let's say, a baked potato bar, we know that a baked potato might have obviously more calories than something like broccoli, but also consider the things that might be toppers. So if you're having students, if they have the ability to add butter or sour cream or cheese to that, again, keep in mind how that contributes to those nutrient standards, and just consider the frequency with which those items are being served. Especially, you know, potatoes, we know that there's lots of different varieties or ways that you could serve those. Just, you know, again, try to make sure that throughout the week, variety has been integrated into those menus. All right, and then the other subgroup would be the portion sizes required for grades K through 8 would be 1/2 of a cup per week. Grades 9 through 12 would be 3/4 of a cup per week. And some items that would fall under this subgroup would include green beans, cucumbers, romaine lettuce or cabbage, and then mushrooms. And there's more examples again on that handout. But again, this is going to be some of those items that just don't necessarily fall really nicely into any of those other subgroup categories. Sometimes I have had the question of, well, green beans, won't those count under the dark green? And unfortunately, no, they don't. They would count in this other subgroup. So just make sure you know how those items contribute and what subgroups they would credit towards. And then on this next page, we also know that sites serve mixed vegetables or blended vegetables quite often. So in terms of crediting these items in something like those classic mixed vegetables, there's obviously too many different types of vegetables in there to be able to offer or ensure that 1/8 of a cup of each type of vegetable is being served. So it's not like you're sifting through and you're saying, okay, there's Johnny got 1/8 of a cup of corn, but he only got, this many green beans or this many carrots. That, for instance, you would just serve, or that would credit towards that other category, other subgroup category. Whereas a California blend of vegetables, so a 3/4 cup serving would provide 1/4 of a cup of each red, dark green, and other. So that one can credit towards 3 of those different subgroups a little bit more easily. But again, do note the 3/4 cup serving size. So as a nice segue, we're going to also now talk about fruit and vegetable bars. And I know that throughout the pandemic, there's been a little bit of issue with operating these. Maybe sites didn't want the utensils being handled amongst students, or maybe you went to more grab and go type containers. But this is a really nice way to help ensure that you can meet those various subgroups for the vegetables. It also offers choices. So we can see some really helpful visual pictures. If Taylor, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide. We know that we all eat with our eyes first. And so if we see these lots of different colors and textures, it's going to help stimulate some of that. Oh, hey, I want to try this, or I want to add this. So it allows our customers or students to really determine what they want. That increases customer satisfaction. It might help increase participation in your program. But like I also said, it benefits you in meeting those meal pattern requirements for those weekly subgroup categories. Now, on this next slide, so we were talking again in some of our other trainings about the pre-portioning for self-service. And this can be a really great option depending on your site. Obviously, there's some considerations. So we know that there's labor involved in planning or prepping each of these separate portions. There's maybe a larger cost involved because you're purchasing those containers or those cups and lids to portion those items in. But this could be an alternate for those fruit and vegetable bars so that all students have access to different vegetables, different fruits. Maybe it helps move your line through a little bit quicker so students have longer time frame to actually eat or consume their meal. But again, you have to determine what is the best method for your particular site. So in these images, we can see lots of different, again, we have cupped vegetables. We have some that are just in boats. We have some that are in other like bowl type servings. We have our just fresh apples there. We have fruit cups. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about this. And again, we want to encourage you to consider what works best for your particular site. And also, again, working with your administration in terms of what are some of those appropriate pandemic precautions also, if that is something that is still a factor for you. On the next site, we also see lots of color, but I like the idea. So in the top corner, we see those vegetable cups and they have the dip at the bottom. So that might be exciting for students if they're like, I don't really love celery on its own, but hey, if you give me some homemade ranch dressing, I'm a little bit more prone to eat that or try that. Maybe students have never tried peppers before. The other thing that I noticed within this image, besides just the color variations though, are the different textures or the different forms. So we see applesauce, we see raisins, we see watermelon, we see canned fruits. So again, having or giving some options or variety to let students make that autonomous decision on what they like and what they are going to be more apt to eating is, in my opinion, a really great idea. I'm not saying you have to have 15 different fruits or vegetable servings. Obviously, that's not sustainable, but giving a little bit of variety is a great way. And you can do that with fresh, frozen, canned, dried. Again, the way that they're prepared, sliced, diced, that could also impact whether a student opts for that particular option. Right, next slide. Another thing that I do like to also mention when it comes to fruit and vegetable bars is making sure that there's considerations that all grade groups are able to participate in those. We want to make sure that even those littlest or those youngest children who might not be able to quite reach on all of the options on the fruit or vegetable bar, maybe you work with your maintenance department or your music department to borrow a riser so they have a step up and they can see what they're grabbing. Having these tray shelves so students can set their trays down and they're not having to juggle everything else that's already on their tray and worry about spilling, which might cause them to say, no, I'm going to just take what's on the line and bypass some of those options, even though they might really like those options that are on the fruit and vegetable bar. So making sure that those appropriate modifications are in place so that all students, regardless of their age, can participate in that option if that is something you have available at your site. And then lastly, I touched on this a little bit, but just some considerations in terms of the types of fruit. So whether you're serving cut versus whole fruit, or maybe you're serving a combination of the two. I think that combination can be helpful because as a mom to an incoming fourth grader last year, she was getting visits from the tooth fairy. So even though normally she loves to bite into a whole apple, and that would be something she wouldn't hesitate to grab on the school lunch line, when she didn't have two front teeth, obviously she had to rethink the options that she was selecting. So if there was only a whole apple there, okay, now all of a sudden, well, I can't maybe take that fruit, I have to take the vegetable. So thinking about that, braces would be another thing. So having some softer fruits available or cut fruits, maybe that's easier. And then also considering the time factor. So, the length of most school lunches is about 20 minutes. And that might include the time that it takes to get through the actual lunch line. So making sure to think about how long is it going to take a second grader to maybe eat a whole apple versus would it be easier, quicker for them to munch on some sliced apples and actually be able to get the nutrition that item is offering them rather than having it get tossed out on their tray. So again, keeping some of those factors or some of those variables in mind. And then next slide, just a reminder to make sure that appropriate serving utensils are utilized if you do have a fresh fruit and vegetable bar. If you want your students to leave the line with a half of a cup of fruit or vegetable, but your spoodle that is set out is, maybe they need 2 scoops to yield that half cup. How do you communicate that with your students? So maybe you have some signage. Maybe that's not necessarily all word signage, but maybe you show them a visual, like the size of a fist is about a half of a cup, so they can kind of help identify what that half cup serving size should look like. Or maybe you have somebody, a teacher or another staff member, that's helping to kind of encourage the appropriate serving size as those students are moving through that line. So with that, we're moving into grains, and I am going to toss it over to Donna to help discuss this section.
Thank you, Laura, and you're making me hungry with all those talking about the vegetables. I'm such a veg head anyway. I want to, first of all, hello everyone. I want to apologize for my voice. I hope it doesn't become too scratchy today. And also, I live about a block from a Lincoln High School. And guess what? Today is the first day of band practice. So I hope that doesn't interfere with what we're going to be talking about here for grains. So I get to talk about, other than vegetables, another fun topic in the school lunch program, and that is grains. And you see here on the slide the requirements for the amounts of grains served daily and weekly. And we see that there's the overlap that we often talk about from grades K through 8 in the daily requirements of 1 ounce equivalents. Now we start talking about grains as ounce equivalents, and that will become more apparent why once Erica starts telling us about grain calculations later. The grade 9 through 12 is 2 ounce equivalent. Now, when you look at the weekly requirements, this is one case where if you just serve 1 ounce for K through 8 through daily, you're not going to meet the weekly requirement, and the weekly requirement must be met. So it's very common for us to tell menu planners, tell food service directors, go ahead and offer 2 ounces equivalents per day, because if you have a school where you're feeding K through 12, then you will cover the requirement for everyone, and it works out pretty well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the type of grain products offered is really important. And as we know, the last few years, we've gone up and down with different requirements for whole grain rich. The definition of whole grain rich has remained the same, but the percentage of items per week that you had to serve that were whole grain rich has varied. 2 years ago, it was 50% whole grain rich items per week. Then it was 100% last year, but then there were waivers because of supply chain issues. And now, because of the transitional standards, at least 80% of the grain items offered at breakfast and lunch per week must be whole grain rich. So what's USDA's definition of whole grain rich? Well, for those who are new and those of you who need to refresh your memory, it means that 50% of the product must be composed of whole grains, and the remaining grains in the product must be enriched. So any item that contains 50% or more of whole grains will meet this requirement, including 100% whole grain products. So yes, 100% whole grain products are also an option. So let's, with this next slide, start talking about those transitional standards. As many of you may be aware, in February of this year, USDA announced the transitional meal standards, and this was in an effort to support school meal program operations while also aiming to improve the nutritional quality of school meals moving forward, which is an ongoing goal. These transitional standards, they went into effect July 1st this year, and therefore they're in effect for the coming school year 22-23. And it's our hope that with ongoing supply chain issues, which are going to continue to happen, it seems, these standards will provide meal pattern flexibilities that the waivers previously allowed for. So that will still be helpful for you folks. Grains are a meal component impacted by these transitional standards, and under the standards, as I said earlier, at least 80% of grains served in school lunch and breakfast each week must be whole grain rich. Whereas previously, last year, if you remember, all grains served were required to be whole grain rich. And over the past year, we've seen the production of many whole grain rich items that you folks use. We've seen that they have been discontinued or that they were not available. And of the meal pattern waiver requests that you submitted to Nutrition Services, the majority of them were related to the whole grain rich flexibility due to these supply chain issues. So with this rule, SFAs may offer enriched grains as 20% of the grains served in school lunch and breakfast weekly, which again offers some flexibility. But you know what? We strongly suggest that SFAs still aim for 100% whole grain rich as a gold standard. You plan for it, you order your items for it, and use this flexibility of 80% only if you need it, ensuring that 80% of the grains on the menu each week are whole grain rich will require some additional work. And you'll need to be sure that you calculate the percentages correctly. So on the next few slides, we're going to provide a few examples on how this may look. We don't offer specific menu items, but we're just talking about the requirement of the ounce equivalents of whole grain that are required every day and weekly. And keep in mind that if you serve an alternate entree, the 80% whole grain requirement is also applicable and a similar pattern should be identified. For example, if your main entree is a whole grain rich hoagie made with a whole grain rich bun, then if you have an alternate entree as a chef salad, you still need to serve a whole grain rich grain, such as a whole grain rich bun or breadsticks or whatever with the chef salad to make them equal. Okay, next slide. So first of all, let's look at lunch. This is a pretty simple example. We see that there are whole grain rich 2-ounce equivalents offered Monday through Thursday. And on Friday is the day that enriched 2-ounce equivalents would be offered. And this is what I have been told by several food service directors that they plan to do, is plan for whole grain rich throughout the week, but leave that door open on Friday in case you don't get an item in that is whole grain rich. And that way you can have that flexibility. So to determine whether you've met the 80% whole grain rich requirement, you divide the total number of whole grain rich ounces, which is 8 ounces offered this week, as you see on the slide, by the total number of grain ounce equivalents, which is 10, and we end up with 80%. And so again, that's kind of the easiest way to look at this. Now on the next slide, we'll see another example. We'll see that the enriched is spread throughout the week and not just reserved for one day, such as Friday. So this option still meets the 80% whole grain rich requirement. You see Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we have 2 ounces equivalents of whole grain rich. And then on Tuesday, Thursday, we have 1 ounce each whole grain rich and enriched. So the total of whole grain rich is still 8 ounces divided by the number offered for the week. And that basically ends up calculating out to be 80%. So keep in mind, again, that if you have something offered on Monday that is a whole grain rich hamburger on a bun, for example, with a whole grain rich bun, then your other alternate entree choices must also be equivalent to that. Okay, next slide. Now this one gets a little bit funkier and a little bit more complicated. You see that breakfast and lunch are both included here. And this happens to be a planned short school week. So that means that it's a planned break. You know what's coming. You can plan ahead for it. You would still need to plan to meet the 80% whole grain rich requirement at breakfast and at lunch based on the number of days of that school week. So depending on your breakfast menu and whether you offer meat alternate throughout the week at breakfast, you want to use the same calculation to ensure you meet the 80% requirement. And we're not going to calculate the breakfast menu because I believe Lauren is going to be talking about that in more detail later. And I gladly let her do that. So for the lunch menu shown, it's a little bit easier to look at lunch. We have 2, 4, 6, 7 ounces of whole grain rich out of the 8 ounces total. And the percentage of whole grain rich happens to be 87.5%. So this is showing us a planned school closure. What if you have an unplanned school closure? Like, for example, a snow day. What we would do if we were to review that week, we would use your planned menu, what you plan to serve, to see if you would meet the requirement, because, you know, something like that's out of your control. So ultimately, there are a number of combinations that would allow you to meet the 80% whole grain rich requirement. And I have to admit that I like the first example the best because it's the easiest, but it's whatever works for you and your program. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is labeled recent additions to the whole grain list, and 2019 doesn't seem so recent ago, but these last 3 years have just been wild, as we all know. So it really doesn't seem like it has been that long ago either. But these were approved as additions to the whole grain list in 2019. We haven't talked about them since then. Corn masa, corn flour, hominy grits. They can also be credited as whole grain. Now, the handout that you have in your handout packet was adapted from another state because it's very comprehensive, more comprehensive than the handout we used to give you folks. And I believe it begins on page 3 in your handout packet. So pages 3 and 4 will show you what items are considered to be whole grain rich. And continuing with this thread here in the next slide, another recent addition in 2019 was cornmeal, but it has to be a certain type of cornmeal. Cornmeal must be made with whole grain, corn, or nixtamalized corn to be credited. Now, cornmeal is sometimes made from the entire grain kernel. So to credit it as a whole grain, it has to be the entire grain kernel. It has to say so on the label. A lot of cornmeal is made from only one part of the grain kernel, so it's not a whole grain product. So you have to be really careful in reading your labels. And this refers to things like corn chips and other ingredients, corn tortillas. Cornmeal that's enriched cannot be credited as a whole grain, but would still be a creditable grain item under the transitional meal standards. And you may be wondering what the word nixtamalized means. It's a process that's used in which dried corn is treated with an alkaline solution. And we see this many times being used to make it produces corn flour most of the time. They use it to make corn flour that then they use to make tortillas. So you may see it on the package and ingredient list of tortillas. Okay, next up, just a better explanation example of a label that has enriched grain, enriched wheat flour. Now, enriched wheat flour means that it has had nutrients added to it, and the list is shown here in parentheses. So this is typical of what a label looks like with enriched flour. And you see that most of these items are nutrients are B vitamins. And then we also have iron as the mineral that's added. And you notice that it doesn't say enriched whole wheat flour. So one of the things about whole grains is that for wheat, it has to say whole wheat. So a lot of people get confused by that. But this item could be served as a creditable grain item in the school lunch pattern as long as the 80% whole grain rich requirement was met throughout the week. This would be, for example, the enriched item you may serve on Friday. Okay, so a little bit more about enriched grains, what's creditable under the transitional meal standards. Foods labeled enriched, and if the first ingredient on an ingredient list is an enriched grain or the second grain after water, it can be credited as an enriched grain. Breakfast cereals that are labeled as fortified or the ingredient list identifies the vitamins and minerals added to the product. If fortified, it does not need to be enriched. And I think a good important to make is that a lot of you offer multiple types or varieties of cereals at breakfast. Be careful with this because to meet this 80% whole grain rich requirement, they have to be either all whole grain rich served on the same day or enriched grains. So just keep in mind that if you're mixing enriched and whole grain rich cereals, it's going to make it more difficult to calculate if you're meeting the 80% minimum weekly whole grain rich requirement. So all whole grain rich cereals or all enriched cereals that would be offered. And of course, we recommend whole grain because that would be considered the gold standard. Okay, next slide. Now, this is one thing that I was really confused about when I started 8 years ago working with this program. What the heck does whole grain rich mean? Well, there are 3 criteria that meet the definition of whole grain rich. And we've talked about the first one before, that the product contains at least 50% whole grains by weight. So when you look at a label, a whole grain such as whole wheat flour is the first ingredient, or if water is the first ingredient, the second ingredient must be a whole grain. Well, when would water be the first ingredient? Well, in some of these items that are frozen doughs that have not been baked off yet, you're going to pull them out of the freezer, you're going to bake them off, they're going to lose a lot of moisture. And at that point is when they would be by weight, you would see that whole wheat flour is the biggest first ingredient. But on the label, it's going to say water. But as long as the second ingredient is a whole grain, then it meets that definition. And then any remaining ingredients must be enriched, the grain ingredients. And then you might have small amounts of other grain ingredients that are non-creditable if they are less than 2% of the product formula. So on the next slide, we're determining whole grain rich, and you need, of course, our middle name at NDE Nutrition Services is documentation. So you would need some type of documentation to demonstrate that you are in compliance with meeting the 80% whole grain rich requirement. And we're going to go through these pretty quickly because these basically are, most of them relate to labels and other things that we'll be talking about later in the presentation. But you can have a product ingredient list, a child nutrition label, a formulation statement, a school recipe, a health claim, or if a product contains at least 8 grams whole grain per ounce equivalent. So let's go to the next slide and let's look at an ingredient list. This is a good place to start, especially if you have an ingredient list for a commercial product that you have purchased, even bread. Whole grain must be listed first, and this might be kind of difficult to see, but the first ingredient underlined is whole wheat flour, then water, than enriched unbleached wheat flour. Doesn't matter if the flour is unbleached or bleached, but it's enriched. And that's the kicker, the main point here. So yes, that's considered to be a whole grain rich product. Now, continuing with that information on the next slide, what we saw was a picture of breadsticks. Breads and cereals are referred to as non-mixed items. That means that they are a totally just a grain item. Pasta, things like that fit in this category. Whole grain must be the first ingredient. But you guys serve a lot of mixed component items. You have pizza, you have chicken nuggets with breading, you have corn dogs with batter. So you have some that are part grain, they credit as partially as grain and partially as meat. So for these, whole grain must be the first ingredient listed by weight. And on the label, what you're going to see is generally they'll list the ingredients in the meat component first. Let's say you have chicken nuggets. The chicken ingredients will be listed first, and then it will say, and you kind of have to look for it sometimes, it will say crust. And that's where you need to see your whole grain listed as the first grain ingredient on the label. So next, we have that CN or the child nutrition label. Now this shows us how the entire combination food credits towards all the meal components. And this is great information. What we need to know is for grains, if it says ounce equivalent, it means that it does credit towards whole grain rich. So this chicken stir fry bowl provides 1 ounce equivalent grains per serving. So what if you don't have a CN label? And this is pretty common, and I hope it's getting less common. On the next slide, we'll see that you can request something from the manufacturer called a product formulation statement. And your vendor may be able to help you get this information too. So you have a different one in your packet, and this will be looked at more in depth in the label section, but it also provides crediting information. And so it's really a good thing to have on hand if you don't have the CN label. The next slide shows a school recipe, how recipes can also be used as documentation. After lunch, we're going to talk in more detail about recipes, but you see here that in this recipe, we have whole wheat flour, whole grain cornmeal for a total of 1.5 pounds in the recipe, enriched flour as 1 pound. That tells us that this product is also a whole grain rich product because more than half of the grain in this product is whole grain. So next up, we have a little exercise here. So brush off those annotation buttons. And what we're going to do is take a look at a couple of different ingredient lists and products. And then you're going to decide if it's a whole grain rich or not. So let's pull up the first slide here, the whole grain rich corn dog. Now, yeah, it says whole grain rich, just like Donna, it tells us. Well, I think some of you have been told before that products are whole grain rich, and they aren't necessarily so. So what I want you to look at here is, in the batter ingredients, is this a whole grain rich product? And if so, then put your annotation mark on the slide. Wow, you guys are wild and crazy with that stuff. Awesome. Okay, I think we have, I know some people aren't able to use annotation, so I think for the most part, we have people agreeing that, yep, it's a whole grain rich product. And if we go to the next slide, in bright green, we have listed here the ingredients. Now, water is the first ingredient, but that's okay as long as the second ingredient is a whole grain product, and it is whole wheat flour. And then the second product is also whole grain corn. I want to show you on this one though. On the third line, we say contains 2% or less of, and this particular ingredient is not a grain product, but that's where you will see those grain products that do not credit is after it says contains 2% or less. Okay, so let's go to the next example. Okay, so this says white whole wheat breadsticks. White, what does that mean? Okay, so annotate away. All righty, let's look at the next slide and see if you got that one right. Yes, whole wheat flour is the first ingredient, and then water, and then enriched. So the second grain ingredient is enriched, unbleached wheat flour. Now I want to point out on this one, this says white whole wheat breadsticks. I know a lot of you purchase products that are made with white whole wheat flour, and no, it has not been bleached. It is an actual grain that is grown in different parts of the United States. And if you're a King Arthur fan like I am, I'm not plugging the company, I'm just saying I love their flour, but I use their white whole wheat flour regularly because then my husband doesn't really know that it's good for him. Kind of trickeroony. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, which shows us real briefly here that you may see an FDA health claim that is on could be on a whole grain rich product, and that also makes them whole grain. Next slide. Okay, back to the multiple entrees. You know how we love to tell you folks that we really encourage you to offer more than one entree option if at all possible. Some of you do a terrific job with this. Some of you do what you can with the second entree. And that's all that we ask, is to give the kids a little bit more variety. But remember that all entree choices must be both daily and weekly meal pattern requirements. They must provide the same meat alternate ounces and grain servings so that they're equal for crediting purposes. So again, if you have a day where you have your main entree is a hamburger on a whole grain rich bun, credits is 2 ounces, then that chef salad plus a whole grain rich roll must be equal. The deli sandwich must be on a whole grain bun, and your Uncrustable, which I know are very, very popular, and I cannot stand them. Anyway, personal preference. I know some of the people I work with love them too. So that has to be a whole grain rich product. So last slide in the grain section here. Let's talk a little bit about grain-based desserts, because you do need to, I mean, it's not a bad thing to offer dessert, not every day necessarily, but once in a while. And you must keep your nutrition standards in mind when planning the frequency. A total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts may be offered per week. And again, you know that there are a lot of options here with the recipes that you can, and mixes that are whole grain rich options, and things like fruit crisps. And there are quite a few things that you can offer as a dessert.
Up next, we're going to talk about calculating grain servings. And I know that math is everyone's favorite subject. And since you do have those daily and weekly grain requirements, it is important to know how to determine how a grain item credits and contributes to the meal pattern. So there are 2 ways to calculate grain servings. The first way is you could determine the weight of your product, and you do that either from the package information, the recipe information, or you can weigh the item. You would have to have a food scale to do that. And then you would refer to the USDA grains bread chart. and look up your information on there. And we will go over that and how to use that here coming up on the next slide. So in your handout packet, I believe it's about pages 8 and 9 on your handout packet, you have your grains breads chart. And this is the chart that you use to determine how a grain item contributes to the meal pattern. This chart is divided into 9 different groups. You can see in the black bars listed down the side, you have groups A through I listed down the left-hand column. The grain items are listed in the middle. And then if you look over to the right there on those right-hand columns, you have the portion size, and that's either in ounces or grams. And that is given for how much an item in that group must weigh to credit as either 1 3/4, 1/2, or a 1/4 ounce equivalence of grain servings. So you can see in that far right-hand column, it tells you how much each of those portion sizes would credit for. So let's look at group A. In group A, we see that an item must weigh 0.8 ounces or 22 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Now the items in group B must weigh at least 1 ounce or 28 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains, and so on and so forth down the chart. Next, let's compare the weights needed to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. If you're looking in groups A, B, C down the chart, what do you notice that's happening there? As you go down the list, the food items need to weigh more to count as to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains, because ingredients other than flour are in these products. Let's look at cookies for an example. So plain cookies in group C, it has to weigh 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains, whereas a cookie with nuts, raisins, and chocolate chips falls into group E, and it has to weigh more. It has to weigh 2.4 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Next on that chart, I want to draw your attention to group H. So for rice and pasta, notice that 1/2 cup of cooked rice or pasta equals a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And so if this is your only grain for the day, just keep in mind those grades 9 through 12 would need a full 1 cup portion of rice or pasta to meet the 2 ounce equivalent grain requirement for the day. I sometimes see that as a mistake, or you would have to offer another grain, of course, if you were only going to provide 1/2 cup for those 9 through 12 grades. In group I, cereal, let's take a look there. 1 cup of flake cereal, 1/4 cup of granola, or 1 1/4 cup of puff cereal credits as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Now, sometimes your bowl packs of cereal, if you're doing those will tell you how those credit as well. The other thing I wanted to mention here is you must always round down to the nearest 1/4 of a serving when using this chart. So let's go back up to group A. In group A, let's say your item weighs 0.7 ounces. It's between the 0.8 and the 0.6 ounces. Then you could only credit it for 3/4 ounce equivalents of grains. You can't round up, so you can't round up to the 1 ounce equivalent. Next slide. So there are 2 basic methods to calculate your grain servings. You can weigh your item and compare it to the grains and breads chart like we just talked about, or you can weigh your product and do a little bit of math. We do recommend that you have at least a small digital food scale in your kitchen. You can purchase those lots of places, so be sure that you do have one on hand in your kitchen if you don't already. Okay, so next slide. So here's the equation that you need in order to calculate a grain serving. And that equation is you take the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving from the appropriate group on the grains breads chart. and then that equals the number of grain servings. Then you must round down to the nearest 1/4 serving. So once again, the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving on your grain breads chart, and that will give you the number of grain servings, or how much that item would, how many ounce equivalents that item would credit for. So let's go through an example. We have a homemade cinnamon roll here. It weighs 2.5 ounces. So let's find that on our grain breads chart. If I look on the grain breads chart, I see in group D, I see a sweet roll unfrosted. So that's what I'm going to use for this one. And I see that a sweet roll must weigh 2.0 ounces, 2 ounces, to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So using the equation we just talked about, I take the 2.5 ounces, that's the weight of my grain item, mine weighs 2.5 ounces, and I divide that by 2 ounces, which is how big that roll needs to be to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. And when I take 2.5 divided by 2, I get 1.25. Now, you need to round down to the nearest 1/4 of grain serving, which in this case, it's already in a 1/4 of a grain serving. So a 2.5 ounce roll provides 1.25 or 1 1/4 ounce equivalents of grains. That 2.5 ounce cinnamon roll unfrosted is going to credit for 1 1/4 ounce equivalent of grains. So just because your item weighs 2.5 ounces, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it credits for. So now we're going to do a little activity to practice using our grain breads chart and calculating how these items would credit. So for this activity, you will need your grain breads chart that we discussed in your handout packet. Like I said, that's on page 8 to 9. And then a piece of scratch paper, or you can just write on your notes, on your slide notes. So let's practice the first one together. The first one is a 2 ounce hoagie bun. So I'm going to go to my grain breads chart, and I'm going to find, let's see, I see buns, hamburger and hot dog buns. I think that's the closest thing we have to a hoagie bun. So my hoagie bun weighs, so I find that in group B. So if you want to click on that, Taylor, that should bring up group B answer. And then in group B, an item needs to weigh 1 ounce to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So if I take the weight of my grain item, which is 2 ounces, divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving, that's 1 ounce. 2 divided by 1 equals 2 ounce equivalents. So my 2 ounce hoagie bun is going to credit as 2 ounce equivalents of grains, whole grain rich grains. So I will give you just a couple minutes to come up with your answers, and then we will go through those together. So work on if you're in a group, work on those in a group, or work on those individually. I'll give you 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and go through the answers after you've had a chance to practice these and see if you can make sense of doing this on your own. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving, and we can go, if you're not done, we can follow along and go through these together. So let's look at the blueberry muffin. Let's find muffins on our grain and breads chart. And I see muffins in group D. And for a muffin to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, it needs to weigh 2 ounces. So my muffin is 1.5 ounces. So I take 1.5 divided by 2, and that equals 0.75 ounce equivalents. Up next, we have a cookie, a snickerdoodle cookie. So I see that in group C, and in group C, a cookie must weigh 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. And my cookie weighs 1 ounce. So I take the 1 divided by 1.2, and that equals 0.833. So remember, we can't round up. We can't round that up to 1 ounce equivalent. So we must round down. And so we round down to 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. So my 1 ounce cookie is going to credit as 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. Up next, we have pasta, and we find pasta in group H. And we need a 1/2 cup of cooked pasta to equal 1 ounce equivalent. And I have 1 cup of pasta. So if I take my 1 cup divided by a 1/2 cup, that equals 2 ounce equivalents. So my 1 cup of pasta credits for 2 ounce equivalents of grains. And our last one here is the chocolate chip granola bar, and I find that in group E. I see granola bars with nuts, dried fruit, and or chocolate chip pieces. And so my granola bar needs to weigh 2.4 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. My granola bar weighs 1 ounce, so I take the 1 ounce divided by 2.4 ounces, and that equals 0.416. Now, once again, I have to round down, so I can't round that up to credit it for a 1/2 ounce equivalent. I have to round down to 0.25. So it credits for 0.25 ounce equivalents. My 1 ounce granola bar only credits for 0.25 ounce equivalents of grains. And that's all I have on calculating grains. Up next, we're going to be talking about the milk requirement. And the minimum daily requirement for milk is 8 fluid ounces for grades K through 12. So it's the same for all grades. Grades K through 12 must have 8 fluid ounces. It must be fluid milk. Dried milk is not allowed. It must be served as a beverage. And so what that means is you can't put milk in, let's say, pudding or something like that and have it count towards the milk requirement. Schools must offer at least 2 choices. So unflavored milk can be skim or 1%, and flavored milk can be skim, or new this year, you can also offer 1% flavored milk. And we'll talk about that here in a minute on the next slide about those transitional standards. But the other thing is no other beverage, so juice or water can be promoted as an alternate to milk, and it cannot be served in the place of milk. So you do have to offer 2 types of milk. It can be unflavored, skim, or 1%, flavored, skim, or 1%. And you can, offer these in any combination to meet the requirements. So if you offer, let's say, 1% white milk and skim chocolate milk, then you would be meeting this requirement. Along with the grain transitional standards, the transitional meal pattern standards also impact the milk requirements. So previous requirements were that flavored milk must be fat-free. You could not offer 1% flavored milk. And then unflavored milk could be fat-free or the low-fat 1%. With the new transitional standards for school year 22-23, you can offer fat-free or low-fat 1% milk, flavored fat-free or low-fat 1% milk. You must offer still at least 2 different varieties, and you must offer at least 1 type of unflavored milk. So you can have, those flavored milks, but you also must offer at least 1 type of unflavored milk. And that can be either fat-free, skim, or low-fat 1% at each meal service. For consistency purposes, this standard does apply to all the programs listed here: the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, the Child and Adult Care Food Program for ages 6 and up, the Special Milk Program for ages 6 and up, and Smart Snacks in schools. And just remember, you must still meet the milk variety requirement, so offering those 2 different types of milks. Moving on to milk substitutions, there is a milk substitute handout in your handout packet. Schools may offer a non-dairy beverage that meets the USDA criteria. If you do offer a substitution, it must have the same nutritional content as cow's milk. There are just specific approved varieties, and those are listed on that handout in your sheet. So, for example, if you have a student who's lactose intolerant, you could offer a lactose-free variety of milk. Just remember that juice or water may not be offered as a replacement. Now, if they have a medical statement on file, you are required to make those substitutions as well. So, but it does still need to be one of these milk substitutes. And if it's just, for preference, then, you can choose whether you're going to make that substitution or not. And we will move on to water requirements. There is a requirement for water at each meal service. So drinking water must be available to students at no charge where meals are served. So that's breakfast, lunch, and snack. There are a variety of ways to implement this. So you can see here from the pictures, there's some different options. You could have a milk cooler, you could have, just a water dispenser, you could have water fountains. Now, remember that if you are using a water fountain or a drinking fountain, you do need to have cups or glasses available for students to be able to fill those up during meal service. And we have already went through several of these, but there is a handout in your packet as well that list the non-credible menu items. So these items, they can be served, but they do count towards the nutrient standards. So, the fat, the calories, the sodium, and they also increase your food costs. So you really need to think, when you're providing these, are these reasonable and are these necessary to the meal? So some of these non-credible menu items include condiments, food drinks or cocktails that are not 100% fruit juice, Funyuns or potato chips. Just a reminder, those do not credit as a vegetable, bacon, pudding, and gelatin. So like I said, it's not necessarily wrong to serve them. They can be served, but they don't credit for anything towards the meal pattern, and they do contribute to those nutrient standards, the fat, the calories, and the sodium. So you really need to keep track of that, if you offer these maybe just on an occasional basis. So we've been having fun with this annotate feature, and we're going to continue to use that on our next few slides here. We are going to play a little game called, Does This Meal Meet Lunch Meal Pattern Requirements? So I'm going to go through the menu, and then you can just use your annotate button, either yes or no. You guys are way ahead of me. You're on it. We have in this menu ham, au gratin potatoes, green beans, peaches, and milk. So what do you think? Does this and we're just looking at components here, so not serving size, like how much ham, how much, you know, what is the serving size of the green beans and peaches, but does this one meet meal pattern? I think we're getting mostly no's here. We have a few yeses, but I'm agreeing with those of you who put no, because we are missing a grain. We're missing a grain item. So sometimes we think of potatoes. I see this is kind of a common mistake. We sometimes, when people menu potatoes, they're thinking, okay, potatoes, they're starchy, and they'll think that they have a grain there with the potatoes since those are starchy, but it's not. Potatoes do not credit as a grain. They credit as a vegetable. So this one is missing a grain. All right. Next one, we have over-baked chicken. Yes, over-baked chicken. I know none of you ever over-bake your chicken, but this school did. So they're serving over-baked chicken, romaine salad, assorted relishes, rice pilaf, and milk. So what do you think? Does this one meet the meal pattern requirements? Okay, once again, we have mostly no's, I think, a few yeses, but I also agree with those of you who marked no, because we are missing a fruit here. We have romaine salad, and we're assuming those assorted relishes are vegetables, so we're actually missing the fruit component. We do not have all 5 components, so that would not meet meal pattern requirements. Next one in our game of does this meal meet lunch meal pattern requirements is we have a stack lunch. So you're sending lunches on a field trip or something, and we have a turkey and cheese hoagie, we have sun chips, apple, sugar cookie, and a juice box. Okay, yes, we have almost all no's on this one. So we are, one, probably missing a vegetable. There may be some vegetable on that turkey and cheese hoagie, but one thing, when you are sending stack lunches on field trips or something, you're not doing offer versus serve. So stack lunches must include all food components in the full quantities. So in this case, we would have to serve 3/4 a cup of vegetable for K through 8 and 1 cup of vegetable for grades 9 through 12. So that's a lot of vegetable to send in a stack lunch, but you have to serve all food components in the full quantities. And then also, I don't see any milk here. They sent juice box because they were thinking, oh, that's, easier, more not going to spoil, but you do have to also offer milk. So you are required to send that. I think most people usually send that in a separate cooler to keep it cold, but you do need to send milk as well with those stack lunches. Okay, our next one in does this meal meet lunch meal pattern requirements? You would have a grilled chicken sandwich, and they have an alternate entree, a chef salad, potato wedges, baked beans, watermelon, and milk. So we have some yeses, we have some nos, and I agree, it kind of depends. It depends on what is on that chef salad. Now, remember Donna said that both entrees need to meet meal pattern requirements. So the chef salad would need to have a meat alternate and a grain, because your chicken, your grilled chicken sandwich has your meat alternate and your grain. So you have to meet that meal pattern for every entree. So, you know, if you were serving that chef salad, you would also, you know, need to have probably, you know, a breadstick or a muffin or something like that, so that it also had a grain like your grilled chicken sandwich does with the bun. Okay, and last one, we have a hamburger on a bun, or the other entree choice is a Southwest chicken wrap, the fruit or vegetable bar, and milk. Yeah, you guys are all so smart. We are going with yes, and I agree. Yes, it probably does. If the tortilla, you know, if the tortilla counts as a 2-ounce equivalent of grains, I would say to watch the tortillas. Sometimes we see that as a place that will trip people up. Some of those don't always credit for 2 ounces. You know, some of them are 1.5 ounces. So if your hamburger bun is 2 ounces and you're, you know, wanting those to credit as the same, make sure that your tortilla on your chicken wrap also credits as 2 ounces. But otherwise, yeah, we have all 5 components here. We have the grain, the meat, the fruit, the vegetable, and the milk.